Well, happy Mother's Day to all of the moms here with us this morning. Mary and I were, first of all, everyone looks so wonderful this morning. All the moms, you all look amazing. All the children who are wearing matching their moms. It's like one day of the year. It's like I finally got them to do it. You know, everyone looks fantastic. Mary and I were talking this morning while we were getting ready for church, and we had said, everyone's going to come and everyone's going to look so great, but it does seem like on Mother's Day, all the moms should be allowed to come in sweats, and just like have a latte and everything's fine, right? It's like that should be, I don't know, so I don't know what we're doing, Also, Clara, you did an amazing job. Thank you for reading God's Word to us. It was the juxtaposition. We don't necessarily plan too far in ahead who's going to read what passages, and you did an amazing job with that. The juxtaposition of having a student kind of read those hard verses was not lost on me in the moment. I'm just, so grateful that we're able to do those kinds of things. So we're studying James. And James is a letter that I love because James reminds us to put our faith into practice, right? James reminds us that it isn't enough, that following Jesus isn't just believing true things about God. It's bigger than that. It's more than that, right? It's more than just agreeing with a list of kind of propositions about God. It's like, yep, there's the list. I agree with everything. I sign my name. I'm good. Following Jesus is more than that. It's bigger than just believing true things about God. It's about allowing the gospel, the message of Jesus, to impact and to transform and to speak into every area of life. How we live, how we love, how we think, how we face suffering, how we plan the words that we speak, how we judge people and circumstances, and all of those things. The gospel is meant to speak into that, and the gospel is meant to challenge some of the areas of our life that really need challenging. And one of those areas that James is going to pick up on and is going to challenge in our reading today is the idea of greed. This is something that James is going to go after this morning, and we're going to see that in what James has to tell us this morning, James is going to speak a little differently than maybe he has spoken in other parts of this letter. But we'll talk about that in a minute. I'm so glad that James talks about the idea of greed because it's important. It's uncomfortable to talk about, but it's important that we talk about it because greed is like a poison that ruins everything it touches. And I think one of the best fictional examples of that is Ebenezer Scrooge from A Christmas Carol. Like that's when I think about the idea of greed, that's where my head immediately goes. We're introduced to Ebenezer Scrooge as a miserly, wealthy old man, right? And whose life is devoid of joy, devoid of relationship. He loves one thing, and that's, if you watch the Disney version of it, his pile of gold coins, kind of on his desk, right? That's what he loves. But as we go further and further into the story, we see that Ebenezer wasn't always like that, right? That Ebenezer in his younger years was someone who lived and laughed and loved, and he loved a woman. And they were set to be married. But over the years, Ebenezer's greed, Ebenezer's love for treasure, it poisoned everything until he was finally alone. And what ultimately, I hope I'm not spoiling it for you. Ultimately, what snaps Ebenezer out of this is he looks at his future and is like, that's not what I want. And he makes the decision to go in a different path. And he embraces the path of generosity. And when he does, what happens to Ebenezer? Life comes back into his life. And we see this change in him. And so it's so important that we're talking about this subject. Now, obviously, we're not going to we're done talking about A Christmas Carol. We're going to spend the rest of our time in God's Word this morning. But I love that example, and even the story kind of points to what we're going to learn from James and Jesus this morning, and it's this. Following Jesus, it means rejecting greed and embracing generosity. So, but with that, let's get into our passage this morning. So grab your Bibles and open up to the letter of James, chapter 5, starting in verse 1. That's page 1291 if you're if you're using the seatback Bibles in front of you. And so let's begin right with verse 1. It says, "Come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you." So right from the start, James, he identifies who he's talking to. He's talking to the rich. He's talking to the wealthy. And there are many biblical scholars who think that in this passage, James has wealthy landowners in mind. Wealthy landowners who, because of what they own, impact, could be for good or bad, but in this case, mostly for bad, many of the folks who live within that area. But he identifies his audience. He's talking to the wealthy. And as we're going to see in what James has to say, this very much, what James is going to say is heavy. This is not a message of hope. This is a message of judgment and condemnation. So happy Mother's Day. So glad that you're here this morning. Lunch after church is going to be wonderful. But James begins this, which I just warned you ahead of time, the heavy things that he's about to say. He kicks it off by kind of laying out the consequences. Here's where you are to the wealthy. Look at what he says in verse 2. He says, "Your riches have rotted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosion will be evidence against you, and will eat your flesh like fire." What? "You have laid up treasure in the last days." This is hard, heavy stuff, but in this passage, James echoes the words of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. We've talked about this throughout the letter of James, that James has been, in his writing, has been heavily influenced by the wisdom literature of the Old Testament, thinking about the book of Proverbs, but thinking about the first maybe 9-10 chapters of Proverbs where we get all those wisdom speeches. James has been influenced there, and James has been heavily influenced by Jesus' teaching on the Sermon on the Mount. And I hope you've been watching for it as you've been reading through James. We're constantly hearing James echoing back to Jesus' words in the sermon. And that's what James does right here in this morning. I would just want to read from you. James echoes Matthew 9:19, verse 19, where Jesus says, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal." James echoes the warning of Jesus, and it's like he's saying to these wealthy people, listen, Jesus warns you against this, but that's exactly what you've done. You've placed your trust in your treasure. You've placed your trust in your wealth, and it's not working out for you. In the end, it's ultimately not going to work out for you because what you're trusting in ultimately is unreliable. And James challenges the wealthy, but it's worse than that. Because as we're going to see in these next couple of verses, their greed, their love of money has pushed them to do bad things. Look at what it says next. Verse 4, "Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your field, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you. And the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord." Their love of wealth has pushed them to do bad things. Their love of wealth has pushed them to be dishonest in their business practices. Have you ever encountered somebody that because of their love of money, it pushed them to be dishonest in their business practices? Let me ask you a question. Have you ever been a little dishonest to save some money? A little bit? Yes, sir. Everyone is under 12. They're all going to order from the kids menu. Our oldest is 12 now, and so in just a couple of more months, we're going to turn into liars. No, I'm just kidding. Mary told me not to make that joke. Like, Chris, it's not going to go well. Don't, But, you ever been a little dishonest to save a little money? Oh, no, sir, I don't know how it broke. Honestly, when I opened it, it was broken when I took it out of the box. It's like, that's what's going, this is James. It's like your love of money has pushed you to do bad things. And for them, they have been dishonest in their business practice, and they've cheated the people that work for them. They haven't paid them what they were owed. And James makes the point that God is not blind to this injustice. God's not blind to their sin, and he won't be blind to our sin either. Let's keep reading. You have lived, verse 5, you have lived on the earth in luxury and in self-indulgence, and you have fattened your heart in the day of slaughter. James says, these wealthy, you've lived a life of comfort and indulgence and luxury. You've lived life for yourself. That the choices that you make, the decisions that you make are about you and your comfort and your wants and your desires. James makes the point that these wealthy, they have lived their life under the assumption that as it relates to wealth, as it relates to treasure, money, all of those things, they've lived under the assumption that if it comes to them, it's automatically meant for them to be spent on them. They've believed the consumption assumption. It's the consumption assumption. It's the idea that if it comes to me, it must automatically be for me to spend on myself. And that is not necessarily the case. Because following Jesus, it really does. It means rejecting greed. It means rejecting a me-first, a me-centered way of life. That everything, it's rejecting the idea that everything that comes to me is automatically for me. That's the consumption assumption. And following Jesus rejects that. It says, no, I'm going to reject greed, and instead I'm going to embrace generosity. And James uses strong, harsh, judgment language for that kind of thinking. It's like, hey, you've lived in luxury, and it's like you fattened yourself for the day of slaughter. Like how you, like a farm, I'm not a farm type of person, but I guess it's like where you feed the animals so that they're bigger. Yeah, okay. We all get it. That's as far as I can go with it. I don't have anything else for you. But this is James, and James uses this kind of judgment language to kind of shake these folk and say, what are you doing? You've lived with this assumption, this me-first assumption. And James uses this strong, harsh judgment language to describe that kind of living, that kind of me first, me at the center. If it comes to me, it must be for me kind of thinking. But he's not finished because he has one more charge against them. Look at what he says. Verse 6. He says, you have condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you. James says, your greed has led to the death of the innocent. And that feels extreme. But when you think about it, it's really not extreme, right? Because how often in our world, right, have we witnessed greed? Maybe personal greed, maybe corporate greed, maybe greed on a governmental level, and how often have we witnessed greed lead to the death of the innocent? We've witnessed it too many times. And this is not the way of Jesus. Following Jesus, it means rejecting greed and embracing generosity. Now, those are our 6 verses. And if you notice, maybe you've noticed, James' writing here is different than how he's written throughout the rest of the letter of James. And this is how it's different. James, throughout his letter, he will say hard, difficult things, right? We've experienced that as we've walked through this letter. But James will often offer alternatives in his writing that he does not do here. Usually, when we're walking through these wisdom speeches through James, we'll hear James say something like, hey, this is what you're doing, and it's not good. That's not what it means to follow Jesus. You should do this instead. Right? You know, we've seen that in planning and in our words and all of these things that we've looked at. James offers, here's the alternative way to live. And he doesn't do this here. James just lays out this message, this hard, difficult message of judgment and condemnation. And it's like, well, what's to be made of that? Well, I think there's 2 potential reasons why James is doing this. Reason number 1, I think this message of judgment is meant to be a message of hope to the believers who might be currently sitting under persecution by maybe these wealthy landowners. And if you look at verse 7, which we're going to go there next week, but in verse 7, James says, "Be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord." And then in the verses that come after, he talks about the idea of patience during suffering. So it could be that this harsh, strong judgment language that we're reading in the first 6 verses are James' way of offering comfort and support to believers who are being persecuted for the faith. It's like, listen, I know that these wealthy landowners or whoever it may be are oppressing you and not paying you what they owe you, and this has happened, but you should not lose heart. Be patient and follow God in your suffering because God's justice is on the way. And God will not turn a blind eye to this, and he will not ignore it forever. God's justice will ultimately be done. So I think that's part of what's going on here. But I think the other part of what's going on here in this warning, in what we need to learn from this warning, is James quotes from Jesus' teaching on this subject on the Sermon on the Mount. And it could be that one of the reasons why James ends it where he does is he assumes his readers are familiar with Jesus' teaching on this subject in the Sermon on the Mount. But for our benefit this morning, and so that we can move forward, I'd like us to flip over to the Sermon on the Mount and look at what Jesus has to say on this subject. Because while James doesn't necessarily point the way forward, Jesus does. And so flip over to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 6, that's going to be page 1031 in the Seatback Bibles. And we're just going to look at 3 verses. James chapter 6, verses 19, 20, and 21. Let's read verse 19. It says this: "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal." This is what James is echoing, right, in chapter 5. We've already talked about this. But this is where James stops. But Jesus goes further. And Jesus offers a different way. This is what he says. Verse 20. He says, hey, instead of that, instead of going that route, laying up for yourself treasure on earth, do this instead. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. Jesus tells his listeners, listen, don't invest your hope, don't invest your future in the things of this world. It's not a safe bet. It's not a reliable investment. Instead, you should invest your treasure in the kingdom of heaven. Well, it's like, well, what does that look like? And how do we do that? Look, we do that by following God, by pursuing God. We do that by pursuing the things that matter to God. We do that We do that by using our resources to help move the mission of Jesus forward. We prioritize the things that God prioritizes, and we use our resources to give and to serve and to love and to care for people and to help move the mission of Jesus forward. We do this by rejecting the consumption assumption. We live with the idea that if it comes to me, it's not necessarily for me to spend on myself. Sometimes God puts resources in our hands to allow us to bless and love and serve and care for people. You combat greed with generosity. You fight greed in your own life with generosity. And Jesus says, when you do, you invest your treasure in the kingdom of heaven. And that is an investment that is secure. That's an investment that inflation can't touch. That a down market, a bad economy, crooked executives can't touch. It is secure. But it does one more thing. Look at verse 21. Jesus says, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." God is interested in your heart, not your stuff, and not your bank account. But oftentimes, Jesus makes the point that it's like where we put our treasure, it communicates something about what we really love. And that's what God is after. God wants your heart, not your money, but oftentimes your treasure, it says something about what I really love. And so you combat greed with generosity, because generosity, and I love this, generosity actually has the ability to steer your affections. Generosity, it's like an antidote. It's like a shot in the arm that reminds you, oh, life is bigger than just me, and it helps me reject that me-first mindset, and it actually has the ability to steer your affections. And so James would tell us, and Jesus would tell us, that following him, following Jesus, it means rejecting greed and embracing generosity. And so what does that look like for each of us? What does that mean for each of us? I want to ask you a couple of questions that I think are challenging questions. But they're important questions, and don't worry, you don't have to share your answer with your neighbor. It's going to be fine. But here's question number one. Do you tend to assume that if it comes to you, it's for you? Now, that's not something that we think about in those terms. But when we think about what we have, oftentimes, right, we tend to think about it in terms of, okay, what am I going to do with what I have? And many of us kind of buy into the consumption assumption that if it comes to me, it's automatically meant to be for me to spend on me. And that's not necessarily the case. So that's something to wrestle with. That's something to process and think about. And it's a challenging thing to think about. Here's the second question. Where does greed hold the most sway in your life? Because it does somewhere for all of us. It's part of being human. And so I think part of reflecting on this and thinking about this is just wrestling with that difficult question. Where, if I'm honest, does a me-first way of thinking hold the most sway in my life? Now again, you don't have to share your answer with anybody, but you owe it to yourself to know the answer to that question. You owe it to yourself to at least have thought about that and processed and know, oh, this is where it lands for me. Because that's the only way we're really going to move forward. Okay. I want to suggest two ways forward, two things to think about that help us kind of move forward and process this and make progress. And so the first one is more short-term, and the second one is kind of more long-term. So here's the short-term challenge, and this is something that you could do this week. And here it is. Listen, I want to challenge you to engage in an out-of-the-norm act of generosity this week. What would it look like for you to engage in an out-of-the-norm, and that's the important part, an out-of-the-norm act of generosity this week? Because the out-of-the-norm part, that's the part that kind of shakes us and wakes us and kind of, lift your head up and look around. Oh, there's a whole world around me. So what could some kind of, is there someone in your life who you could love, who you could serve, who you could care for, where you could give, where you could do an out-of-the-norm act of generosity this week? Bonus points if you can involve the whole family. It'd be amazing. What could that look like for you this week? It's like a shot in the arm. It's like a wake up. It's like gosh, that's right. Life is bigger than just me, and everything that comes to me isn't necessarily for me. Last one, and this is more of the more long term. As you think about you, as you think about your life, as you think about all of these things. Now listen, hey, I should say this. I meant to say this earlier. When we think about this subject, when we think about the idea of greed and generosity and combating greed, listen, and when we talk about the idea of rejecting the consumption assumption, right, that everything that comes to me is necessarily meant to be spent on me. Now, that's important and that's true, but it doesn't mean that nothing that comes to you is not meant to be for you. And God provides for our needs, and the resources that God gives us are gifts from Him to be used for His glory, to be used to meet our needs, and to be used to enjoy life. And I love some of the Hebrew wisdom literature that is like, hey, enjoy everything that God has given you. Like, you should receive everything that God gives you as a gift, so you should order dessert. You should go on vacation. I mean, take the trip, do all the stuff, and do it with joy and without guilt. That honors God. But the consumption assumption says that I assume everything that comes to me is automatically meant to be for me. And that's the rub, because that's not the case. Oftentimes, a lot of times, part of the resources that God puts in our hands are so that we can love and serve and give and share and care for people and move the mission of Jesus forward. And so when I talk about that, that's what I'm talking about. Does that make sense? Great. So short term, to kind of wake us up from that is, what's that out of the norm act of generosity that you could engage in this week? Bonus points if you include the whole family, because what a fun thing to get the kids involved and do all this stuff. But more long term, it's just something to think about. What are the more regular practices that I need to put in my life to help me reject greed and embrace generosity? What are the regular practices? What are those regular rhythms that need to become a regular part of my life? Do you need a plan to give? Do you need a plan to serve? Do you need a plan to love? Do you need a plan to think more regularly about the least of these? What are those regular practices those rhythms that you can begin to build into your life to help you embrace generosity and reject greed? It's important. And so you should think about those things. Do I have a plan to give? Do I have a plan to serve? Do I have a plan to love? Do I have a plan to sort of pay attention to the least of these and all of those things? Or is every day of life just centered around me and what I've got going on, what's happening with me and my own stuff? It's like, that's kind of the challenge there. Because the truth is, greed is insidious. And it can poison all kinds of things. And it can ruin relationships. Maybe you've seen that. It's like maybe I think the stereotype is fathers and sons, right? He loved his car more than he loved me, and I could never go into that room because that's where the collection was, and it was the most important thing of the house. And one day, I'm going to get a lot for it when I sell it on eBay. You know what I mean? It's that sort of thing. It kind of creates these weird deals. It's like greed can be insidious and it can poison relationships. But it does not have to happen to you and me. But it begins when we recognize, when we embrace the idea that following Jesus, it really does, it means rejecting greed and embracing generosity.